The Secrets of White Haven. I am Dr. Marcus Blackwood, and I must tell you about the terrible things I saw at White Haven Plantation. This story still haunts my dreams, even now that I am far from that cursed place. I came to Savannah, Georgia in the spring of 1852. I had just finished medical school in Philadelphia and wanted to start my own practice. The yellow fever sickness the year before had killed many local doctors, so there was room for new ones like me. I first met the Pembroke family at a fancy party in May. Charlotte Pembroke, the old lady who ran the family, suddenly fell down during the party at Judge Harrington's house. I was the only doctor there, so I helped her. She had just gotten too hot. This chance meeting got me invited to their plantation, White Haven, and I became their family doctor. I had no idea that taking this job would lead me into the darkest evil I had ever seen. The first time I rode up to White Haven, I was amazed by how grand it looked. The big house sat on a hill, looking out over cotton fields that went on forever. A long road lined with oak trees led from the main road to the house. The trees made a green tunnel that suddenly opened up to show the bright white mansion. It was beautiful and impressive, but something about it felt scary too. Edward Pembroke, who owned White Haven now, met me on the wide front porch. He was 45 years old and still looked strong and tall. His hair was turning gray at the sides, which made him look important, but his eyes were sharp and cold. "Dr. Blackwood," he said, shaking my hand. "Welcome to White Haven. I hope you had a good trip from town." "Yes, Mr. Pembroke. The countryside is very pretty this time of year." Edward smiled, but his eyes didn't look happy. "Yes, though it's getting very hot. Come inside. Mother wants to see you." The inside of White Haven was even more impressive than the outside. The main hall was 2 stories high with a beautiful staircase that curved up to the second floor. Paintings of dead Pembroke family members hung on the walls. Their serious faces seemed to watch us as we walked under them. Charlotte Pembroke saw me in her private sitting room on the east side of the house. She was 73 years old but still looked strong and proud. Her back was straight. Her white hair was done up in an old-fashioned style from 30 years ago. Her hands, twisted with arthritis, rested on the silver handle of a black walking stick. "So, you're the young doctor who stopped me from making a fool of myself at the Harringtons," she said in a strong voice. "I suppose I should thank you for that." "I only did what any doctor would have done, Mrs. Pembroke." She made a small snorting sound. "Don't be modest, young man. It doesn't suit a doctor. Edward tells me you studied in Philadelphia. Under Dr. Marshall, wasn't it?" "Yes, ma'am. I was lucky to learn from him." "Good. We need good medical care here. The last doctor was a drunk who couldn't tell his medicine from his ointment. I expect you'll do better." And so I started working for the Pembroke family. Twice a week, I would ride from Savannah to White Haven to check on Charlotte's health and help anyone in the house who was sick. The pay was good, and being connected to such an important family would help my new practice grow. During those early visits, I met the rest of the Pembroke family. There was Margaret, Edward's wife. She was a quiet woman with sad eyes who always seemed like she wanted to say sorry for something. Their children were William, who was 20, Elizabeth, who was 19, and young Thomas, who was just 15. They had the usual problems of young people. William sometimes got hurt while hunting, Elizabeth had headaches that I thought were more from worry than sickness, and Thomas had a cough that got worse in damp weather. Then there was James Pembroke, Edward's younger brother by 5 years. Where Edward was all controlled power, James was wild energy that he could barely keep under control. He had a bad reputation in Savannah as a gambler and someone who chased women, though his family connections kept him out of serious trouble. "You'll have to excuse my brother," Edward told me after James had said something rude during dinner. "He never learned how to behave properly around good people." James had laughed. "And you, dear brother, never learned that there's more to life than being proper and making money." The tension between the brothers was easy to see, though I didn't understand why at the time. It was during my 4th visit to White Haven that I first noticed something strange. Charlotte had complained about a cold draft in her room, and Margaret had called a house servant to check it. The young man, I think his name was Samuel, started tapping along the wall, listening for hollow spots that might show a gap in the wall covering. "No use checking there, boy," Charlotte snapped. "That section is next to the old cellars. The draft must be coming from somewhere else." "I didn't know Whitehaven had cellars, Mrs. Pembroke," I said. "Most houses in the low coastal areas didn't build underground rooms because of the high water level." A strange look passed between Charlotte and Edward, who had just come into the room. "Just some old storage areas under the east wing," Edward said smoothly. "Hardly worth mentioning. They've been sealed up for years now." "Since before the current house was built," Charlotte added. "My husband's father, the first William Pembroke, built the foundation over the old root cellars from the original homestead. I didn't think much about it at the time. Big old houses often had their odd features and secrets. Strange building details piled up over many years of additions and changes. It was a chance conversation with Thomas, the youngest Pembroke, that first made me curious about what lay under Whitehaven. I had been treating the boy's cough with a syrup made from cherry bark and honey, and we had become friends. Unlike his stern father and proud older brother, Thomas was naturally warm and curious, which I found refreshing. "Dr. Blackwood," he said one afternoon as I was getting ready to leave, "have you ever heard strange noises at night?" "What kind of noises, Thomas?" He looked around like he was afraid someone might hear us. "Like voices coming from the walls. Sometimes I think I hear crying." I smiled gently. "Old houses settle and creak, especially ones as big as Whitehaven. The wind can make all sorts of strange sounds as it moves through the roof and chimneys." "It's not the wind," he insisted. "Sometimes I hear words and footsteps, like someone walking back and forth in a small space. Perhaps one of the servants moving around late at night." He shook his head. "It comes from below, from under the floor." He lowered his voice to a whisper. "I think it's coming from the old cellars." Before I could ask him more questions, Margaret appeared in the doorway. "Thomas, your father is looking for you. It's time for your lessons." She smiled at me, though her eyes looked worried. "I hope he hasn't been bothering you with his stories, Dr. Blackwood." "Not at all. We were just talking about his treatment." "Well, run along now, Thomas. Don't keep your teacher waiting." As the boy left, Margaret stayed behind. "Thomas has a big imagination. He's always been interested in ghost stories and such things. Most boys his age are. I wouldn't worry about it." She twisted her handkerchief between her fingers. "Yes, well, Edward doesn't like such silly ideas. If you hear Thomas talking about such things again, I'd appreciate it if you would discourage him." There was something in the way she acted, a nervousness, almost a fear, that struck me as odd. But it wasn't my place to question how the Pembroke family chose to raise their children. "Of course, Mrs. Pembroke." The incident might have been forgotten if not for what happened the following week. A heavy summer storm had washed out part of the road to Savannah, forcing me to accept Edward's invitation to spend the night at Whitehaven. After dinner, the family went to the drawing room, where Charlotte insisted on a game of whist. I was paired with Elizabeth against Edward and Margaret. James had excused himself earlier, claiming he had somewhere to be in town despite the storm. This had caused a cold remark from Edward about duties to the family, which James had ignored with practiced ease. We were halfway through our second game when a commotion erupted from the direction of the kitchen. Raised voices, the sound of breaking dishes, and then a woman's scream cut through the gentle atmosphere of the drawing room. Edward stood up immediately. "Excuse me. I'll see what this is about." "I'll come with you," I offered, thinking there might be an injury that needed my attention. He hesitated briefly, then nodded. "Very well." We found the source of the trouble in the back hallway that connected the main house to the kitchen building. A young woman, one of the house servants, was crying hysterically while an older woman tried to calm her. Broken pieces of what had once been a china serving dish lay scattered across the floor. "What is the meaning of this?" Edward demanded. The older woman, Mrs. Davis, the housekeeper as I later learned, curtsied quickly. "I'm terribly sorry for the disturbance, Mr. Pembroke. Lucy here was bringing up the dessert service when she had a fright." "A fright from what?" Lucy, still sobbing, could barely speak. I saw I saw. Speak up, girl, Edward snapped. A hand, sir, she finally managed, coming up through the floorboards, right in front of me, clear as day. A white hand reaching up like it was trying to grab me. Edward's face grew dark. Nonsense. You saw a shadow or a rat. There's nothing under these floors but solid earth. I know what I saw, sir, Lucy insisted, then immediately looked down as if she regretted being bold. You've been listening to Thomas's foolish stories, haven't you? Edward turned to Mrs. Davis. I won't have this superstitious nonsense in my house. See that Lucy cleans up this mess and then report to my study. Yes, Mr. Pembroke. As we walked back to the drawing room, I asked a question. Could there be some access to the old cellars near that hallway? Perhaps the girl saw something through a gap in the floorboards. Edward stopped suddenly, his face carefully blank. There is nothing under that part of the house, Dr. Blackwood. The old cellars, as I've mentioned, are under the east wing, and they've been sealed for decades. Lucy is a fanciful girl who broke a valuable dish and made up a ridiculous story rather than admit her clumsiness. His tone said the discussion was over, and we rejoined the ladies without another word on the subject. But later that night, as I lay in the guest bedroom, unable to sleep because of the continuing storm, I found myself thinking about Lucy's terror. It had seemed real, not the fake emotion of someone trying to avoid punishment. And then there was Thomas's talk of voices under the floor. My room was on the second floor of the west wing, far from the east wing where the supposed cellars lay. Yet, as I listened to the rain beating against the windows and the occasional rumble of thunder, I began to imagine that I could hear other sounds under the storm's noise. Faint rhythmic noises that might have been footsteps, or might have been my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. Sleep finally took me, but my dreams were troubled by images of pale hands reaching up through cracks in a wooden floor, grasping at empty air. Morning brought sunshine and clear thinking. In the bright light of day, the nighttime fears seemed silly. I joined the family for breakfast, noting that James had still not returned from town. Edward made no mention of the previous night's disturbance, and neither did I. As I was getting ready to leave, Thomas approached me in the hallway. Did you hear them last night, Dr. Blackwood? He whispered. The voices. I shook my head. Just the storm, Thomas. He looked disappointed. It's always louder during storms. Father says it's just the rain in the gutters, but I know it's not. He glanced around secretly. Elizabeth has heard them too, but she won't admit it anymore. Not since Father got so angry about it last year. Perhaps you should follow your sister's example, I suggested gently. Your father doesn't seem to like these stories. Thomas's face fell. You don't believe me either. I placed a hand on his shoulder. I believe that you believe what you're hearing, but sometimes our minds play tricks on us, especially at night. It's not tricks, he insisted. And Lucy saw one of them trying to get out. Everyone in the kitchen is talking about it. Before I could respond, William appeared at the end of the hall. Thomas, Father's looking for you. Thomas gave me one last pleading look, then hurried away. William watched him go, then turned to me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, just like his father. I hope my brother hasn't been bothering you with his ghost stories, Dr. Blackwood. Not at all. We were discussing his cough. William nodded, though he clearly didn't believe me. Thomas has always had too much imagination. Mother spoils him too much, in my opinion. He's young yet. He'll outgrow such fancies. Indeed. William studied me for a moment. You know, Dr. Whitehaven has stood for nearly 50 years without a single supernatural incident. We Pembroke are practical people, not given to superstition. It would be unfortunate if rumors were to spread based on a child's imagination and a servant's hysteria. The threat was hidden but clear. I assure you, Mr. Pembroke, doctors don't usually spread gossip about their patients or their patients' families. Of course, I meant no offense. He smiled again, cold and calculating. Safe journey back to town, Doctor. The road had been mostly repaired overnight, and my return to Savannah was smooth. In the days that followed, I found my thoughts returning frequently to Whitehaven and its possible secrets. Professional rules demanded discretion regarding the Pembroke family, but my curiosity had been awakened. Under the guise of historical research, I began asking careful questions about Whitehaven and its construction. At the Savannah Historical Society, I discovered that the current manor house had indeed been built by William Pembroke II around 1810, replacing a simpler structure from the 1780s when the first William Pembroke established the plantation. The original Pembroke was quite the character, explained Mr. Holloway, the elderly curator of the society. Came down from Virginia with barely a penny to his name, but somehow managed to acquire 500 acres of prime land just as cotton was becoming king. Quite an achievement, I remarked. I understand Whitehaven now encompasses several thousand acres. Indeed, each generation of Pembroke has expanded the holdings. The current Mr. Pembroke, Edward, isn't it? Added the Preston tract about 10 years ago when old man Preston went bankrupt. Holloway leaned closer. There are those who say the first William Pembroke didn't come by his initial land honestly, but such rumors are common about successful men. What sort of rumors? Holloway shrugged. The usual, that he cheated someone or threatened them or worse. Nothing proven, mind you. The records show a perfectly legal land transfer from a Mr. Jonathan Mercer in 1782. And this Mercer, what became of him? That's where the story gets interesting. He disappeared shortly after the sale. Some said he returned to England, others that he went west. A few of the more dramatic versions suggest Pembroke killed him to ensure his silence about something. Holloway chuckled. As I said, successful men often attract such tales. I found no further information about Jonathan Mercer in the Society's records, but the name stuck in my mind. On my next visit to Whitehaven, I made a point of examining the family portraits more closely. In the dining room hung a painting of the first William Pembroke, a severe-looking man with cold eyes and a thin mouth. The artist had shown him standing beside a writing desk, one hand resting on a ledger, the other holding what appeared to be a land deed. Charlotte caught me studying it during dinner. My father-in-law, she said, following my gaze. Not a handsome man, but a determined one. He built the foundation of everything you see around you. An impressive legacy, I commented. Yes, though not without cost. Something in her tone made me look at her more closely. Great fortunes are rarely built by gentle means, Dr. Blackwood. Edward cleared his throat. Mother, I'm sure Dr. Blackwood isn't interested in ancient family history. On the contrary, I said, I find the development of Whitehaven fascinating. I was reading recently about the original land grant from a Mr. Mercer, I believe. A subtle tension fell over the table. Edward's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Margaret glanced anxiously between her husband and Charlotte. Only James, who had chosen to join the family that evening, seemed amused by the sudden discomfort. Oh ho, he said, reaching for his wine glass. The good doctor has been digging into the family skeletons, has he? James, Edward warned. Charlotte tapped her cane against the floor. It's no secret that the original purchase was from Jonathan Mercer. The deed hangs in your father's study, Edward. I wasn't suggesting otherwise, Edward replied stiffly. Merely that it's hardly appropriate dinner conversation. Charlotte ignored him, fixing her sharp gaze on me. What else have you heard about Mr. Mercer, Doctor? Only that he disappeared shortly after the sale. Returned to England, some say. James snorted. That's the polite version. Enough, Edward snapped. Thomas, Elizabeth, you are excused. Go to the drawing room with your mother. Thomas looked ready to protest, but a stern glance from his father silenced him. The three left, leaving me with the Pembroke siblings and their mother. As soon as the door closed, Edward turned to me. Dr. Blackwood, I'm not sure what you're implying with these questions, but I assure you that the Pembroke claim to Whitehaven is legally unquestionable. Every acre has been properly purchased and documented. I wasn't suggesting otherwise, I said, genuinely surprised by his strong reaction. My interest is purely historical. History can be a dangerous thing to dig up, Charlotte said quietly. Some things are better left buried. James laughed, the sound harsh in the tense atmosphere. How delightfully dramatic, Mother. Why not tell the doctor the truth? It's hardly a secret in certain circles. James. Edward's voice was low with warning. What? That our illustrious ancestor may have murdered Mercer and his entire household? That the East Cellars were once. Enough. Edward slammed his hand on the table, making the crystal shake. One more word and I swear to God I will cut you off without a penny. James fell silent, though the mocking smile remained on his face. Charlotte looked suddenly tired, the commanding matriarch replaced by an old woman burdened by secrets. Dr. Blackwood, Edward said, his voice carefully controlled. You must understand that old plantations attract all manner of wild stories. Mercer sold the land to my grandfather and then left Georgia. Everything else is malicious gossip spread by those jealous of our family's success. Of course, I said, though I was now certain there was more to the story than Edward was admitting. I apologize if my questions caused any offense. The rest of the dinner passed in strained conversation about safer topics. The cotton harvest, the upcoming horse races in Charleston, the recent sermon at St. John's Church. But the tension never fully went away, and I was relieved when the evening finally ended. As I was getting ready to leave, James approached me in the front hall. A word of advice, Doctor, he said, his voice low. Don't dig too deeply into Pembroke history. Edward takes the family honor very seriously. So I've noticed. James glanced toward the dining room where Edward could be heard speaking with Charlotte. My brother believes that wealth can bury the past. Perhaps he's right. He smiled, though there was no humor in it. But I've always found that corpses have a way of rising, no matter how deeply they're buried. With that cryptic remark, he walked away, leaving me to think about his words on the journey back to Savannah. The following week brought an unexpected development. A messenger arrived at my office in town with an urgent summons to Whitehaven. Thomas had taken a fall from his horse and injured his arm. I found the boy in his bedroom, pale but brave, his left arm swollen and clearly broken. It's a clean break, I told Edward after examining the injury. I've set it properly, and with rest it should heal well. He's young and healthy. Edward nodded. Thank you for coming so quickly. Of course. If I may ask, how did the accident happen? Before Edward could answer, Thomas spoke up from the bed. It wasn't an accident. Diablo spooked near the old stone wall at the east end of the property. Something scared him badly. The wind, most likely, Edward said. Or a snake. It wasn't the wind, Thomas insisted. And I would have seen a snake. Diablo was fine until we rode past that section of the wall, and then he just panicked, reared up, and threw me off. It was like he saw something that terrified him. Edward's jaw tightened. Horses are unpredictable creatures. That's why I've told you repeatedly to be more careful when riding alone. I wasn't alone, Thomas said. Lucy was with me. Lucy? I asked, remembering the frightened servant girl from my previous visit. She was gathering herbs from the kitchen garden, Thomas explained. She saw the whole thing. Tell him, Father. Tell Dr. Blackwood what Lucy said she saw. Edward's expression had grown thunderous. Lucy is no longer employed at Whitehaven. You dismissed her? I asked, surprised. This morning, after her hysterics upset Thomas and likely contributed to his accident. That's not true. Thomas tried to sit up, wincing as the movement jarred his injured arm. Lucy saw it too, just like at the house. A hand coming up from the ground near the wall. She screamed, and that's what spooked Diablo. Edward turned to me, his face rigid with controlled anger. Dr. Blackwood, I'd appreciate a moment alone with my son. I nodded, gathering my medical bag. Of course, I've given him laudanum for the pain. He should rest now. I'll see you out. In the hallway, Edward stopped and rubbed his temples as if fighting a headache. I apologize for my son's behavior. The fall and the medication have made him confused. It's not uncommon for patients to experience some disorientation after trauma, I said neutrally. Yes. Well, in this case, I believe Thomas's imagination was already inflamed by that servant girl's ridiculous stories. I had no choice but to dismiss her. Her superstitious nonsense was infecting the entire household. Do you know where she went? I'd be concerned about her mental state if she truly believes she's seeing supernatural phenomena. Edward waved a dismissive hand. Mrs. Davis arranged for her to return to her family in Augusta. She'll be fine once she's away from here. He fixed me with a stern look. I trust you won't repeat any of this foolishness in town. The Pembroke name carries weight in Savannah society, and I would hate to see it tarnished by ignorant gossip. As I've said before, patient confidentiality is sacred to me. Good, because while I value your medical services, Dr. Blackwood, they are not irreplaceable. The threat was no longer veiled. I nodded my understanding and took my leave. But as I rode away from Whitehaven, I found myself looking back at the imposing white mansion. For the first time, I noticed how isolated it was, surrounded by fields with no neighbors for miles. Perfect place to keep secrets. My concern for Lucy led me to make discreet inquiries in town. To my surprise, I discovered that she had not gone to Augusta, as Edward claimed. Her cousin, who worked as a laundress for the Harrington family, had received no word from Lucy since her dismissal. She wouldn't just leave without saying goodbye, the young woman insisted. And all her things are still in the servants' quarters at Whitehaven. Mrs. Davis said Mr. Pembroke wanted her gone immediately. No time to pack. Could she have gone somewhere else? Another relative, perhaps. The cousin shook her head. We're all she has in Georgia. Her parents died in the fever last year. This information disturbed me deeply. Either Edward had lied about Lucy's destination, or something had happened to prevent her from reaching Augusta. Neither possibility reflected well on the Pembroke family. My unease grew when 2 days later I encountered James Pembroke at a gambling house in one of Savannah's less reputable districts. He was deep in his cups, having apparently lost heavily at cards earlier in the evening. "Ah, the good doctor," he slurred when he spotted me. "Come to check the health of Savannah's less fortunate souls?" "I was visiting a patient nearby," I said, which was true enough. "You seem in need of some fresh air, Mr. Pembroke." "What I need is more whiskey and better luck." Despite his protest, he allowed me to guide him outside and into a nearby coffee house that catered to late-night patrons. Once settled with strong coffee before him, James seemed to regain some of his composure. Edward would be scandalized to see me in such a state. The great Pembroke name dragged through the gutter by the black sheep. "Your brother does seem concerned with the family's reputation." James laughed bitterly. "Obsessed is more like it. The mighty Pembroke legacy, built on cotton and blood." I hesitated, then decided to take advantage of James's drunken honesty. "You mentioned something at dinner the other night about the first William Pembroke and Jonathan Mercer." James's bloodshot eyes narrowed. "Did I? How indiscreet of me. You suggested there was more to the story of how your grandfather acquired Whitehaven. Ancient history, Doctor. Ancient history written in blood." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Did you know that before Whitehaven was Whitehaven, it was called Mercer's Hope? Jonathan Mercer built that place from nothing. A small farm at first, then a proper plantation as cotton took hold." "What happened to him?" James took a long swallow of coffee. "The official story? He sold the plantation to grandfather and disappeared. The whispered truth." He made a slashing motion across his throat. "Grandfather wanted that land, and Mercer wouldn't sell. Until suddenly he did. Signed over everything for a fraction of its worth and vanished." "You're suggesting your grandfather murdered him?" "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm drunk, remember?" James's smile was razor-sharp. "But consider this. Mercer had a wife, 3 children, and 20 household servants, all of whom apparently returned to England with him. Rather odd for a man who'd spent 15 years building a life in Georgia, wouldn't you say?" A chill ran through me. 24 people, all told. At least, plus the field workers, though most of them were sold off separately after the purchase. Grandfather preferred to bring in his own people. James tapped his finger against the table. 24 from the house, plus whoever else displeased him over the years. Our grandfather was not a forgiving man. You can't possibly be suggesting. The east cellars, Doctor. The ones that have been sealed up for years. James leaned back, his eyes suddenly sharp despite the alcohol. Why do you think my dear brother is so insistent that no one goes near them? Why dismiss a servant for telling ghost stories? Why threaten a doctor who asks innocent questions about family history? If what you're implying is true, it's monstrous. Welcome to the glorious Pembroke legacy. James raised his coffee cup in a mock toast. Built on cotton and blood. Have you seen these cellars yourself? James's expression darkened. Once, when I was about Thomas's age. Found a loose board in the east wing floor and got curious. Edward caught me before I could explore properly, but I saw enough. He shuddered. Father gave me the thrashing of my life when Edward told him. Said if I ever went down there again or spoke of what I'd seen, he'd lock me in with the others. Others? You saw bodies? Not bodies. Not anymore. James drained his cup. Just bones, Doctor. Dozens and dozens of bones. Some still with scraps of cloth clinging to them. He stood abruptly. I've said too much. Blame it on the whiskey if you like. But if you're wise, you'll forget this conversation ever happened. And if I don't? His smile was sad now. Then you'll likely join the collection beneath Whitehaven. My brother protects the family secrets as fiercely as father did. More so, perhaps. With that, he staggered out into the night, leaving me with the horrifying implication that the Pembroke fortune was built on mass murder, and that the tradition might be continuing. I spent a sleepless night wrestling with my conscience. If James's drunken confession held any truth, then not only had the first William Pembroke committed atrocities, but Edward might be actively covering up those crimes, possibly even adding to the toll. Lucy's disappearance took on a sinister new meaning in this context. But what could I do? I had no proof beyond the ramblings of a drunkard who clearly resented his brother. Going to the authorities with such wild accusations against one of Savannah's most prominent families would be professional suicide at best. And at worst, if James was right about Edward's ruthlessness, it could be literal suicide. The next morning brought no clarity, but it did bring another summons to Whitehaven. Charlotte had taken a turn for the worse, the messenger said. Her heart was giving her trouble. Duty compelled me to go, despite my misgivings. I found Charlotte in her bedroom, looking frilier than I had ever seen her. Her pulse was weak and irregular, her breathing labored. It's her heart, Margaret whispered as I completed my examination. Isn't it? I nodded. I believe so. I can leave some digitalis, but at her age. I let the implication hang in the air. I'm dying, not deaf, Charlotte rasped from the bed. No need to whisper about it. You're very ill, Mrs. Pembroke, I said, moving back to her side. You should rest. Rest? I'll have an eternity to rest soon enough. Her gnarled hand shot out with surprising strength, grasping my wrist. Send Margaret away. I need to speak with you alone. Margaret looked uncertain. Mother Pembroke, I don't think. Go. The command was weak but imperious. Charlotte Pembroke was accustomed to being obeyed, even on her deathbed. Once we were alone, Charlotte sank back against her pillows. You've been asking questions, Doctor. Dangerous questions. I'm not sure what you mean. Don't play the fool. It doesn't suit you. She coughed, a dry, rattling sound. James talks when he drinks, and he drinks often. I remained silent, waiting. What do you think you know about this family? She asked. Only what I've been told. Lies and half-truths, no doubt. Charlotte's eyes, clouded with age and illness, fixed on mine. Let me tell you a story, Doctor, about a young woman who married into wealth and power, only to discover the terrible price of that privilege. Mrs. Pembroke. Silence. I haven't much time. She drew a labored breath. William Pembroke, my husband, not his father, was a hard man, but he wasn't evil. Not at first. It was the secret that twisted him. The secret his father shared with him on his deathbed. The same secret he eventually shared with Edward. The cellars, I said quietly. She nodded. The cellars and what's in them. 89 souls, Doctor. That's what William told me before he died. 89 people who stood in the way of Pembroke ambition. Horror washed over me. Including the Mercer family? They were the first. Jonathan, his wife Sarah, their children Thomas, Mary, and little James, and their household staff. All gone in a single night of blood. Charlotte's voice had fallen to a whisper. William's father gave them poisoned wine at dinner. Those who didn't drink were dealt with differently. And your husband knew this? Participated in it? No, it happened before our marriage, but he inherited the secret along with the wealth it created. She paused, struggling for breath. And then, when business rivals or troublesome creditors threatened the Pembroke fortune, sometimes they would disappear. William said it was necessary to protect the family, to protect me and our sons. Edward and James, I murmured. Edward is his father's son. Believes in the family above all else. Charlotte's eyes filled with tears. But James has a conscience. It's why William always favored Edward. Why Edward inherited everything but a small allowance for James. Did Edward continue the practice? Charlotte turned her face away. I don't ask. I don't want to know. But people still disappear sometimes. People who cause problems for the Pembroke family. Like Lucy. Her eyes snapped back to mine, suddenly sharp. The servant girl? What about her? She's missing. After being dismissed for talking about seeing something near the old stone wall. Charlotte closed her eyes. God forgive us all. Mrs. Pembroke, if what you're saying is true, these are terrible crimes. They must be brought to light. And destroy my family? My grandchildren? She shook her head weakly. I've made my peace with my sins, doctor. I'll face my judgment soon enough, but I won't see my family name dragged through the mud in my final hours. Then why tell me this at all? Her hand found mine again, her grip painfully tight. Because someone needs to end it. The killing must stop. Edward. He believes he's protecting the family, just as his father did. But he's damning them. Damning all of us. Tears slipped down her wrinkled cheeks. Save my grandson, doctor. Save Thomas. He's not like the others. There's still hope for him. What would you have me do? Get him away from Whitehaven. Away from his father's influence. Before he learns the family secret. Before it corrupts him too. Her breathing had become more labored. Promise me. I promised to try, I said, though I had no idea how I could possibly fulfill such a pledge. She seemed to read the doubt in my face. The proof you need, it's there in the cellars. Access through the old pantry, eastern wall, behind the shelves. Mrs. Pembroke, you need to rest now. No time for rest. Her voice was fading. Tell James. Tell him I'm sorry for not being stronger. For not stopping it when I could. Those were her last clear words. She slipped into unconsciousness shortly after, and by nightfall Charlotte Pembroke was dead. The funeral was held 2 days later at the small family cemetery on the Whitehaven grounds. The Pembroke Mausoleum, a granite structure with classical columns and an angel standing guard at its doors, received Charlotte's casket with solemn ceremony. All of Savannah society turned out to pay respects to the grande dame of one of Georgia's most prestigious families. Throughout the service, I found myself studying the faces of the Pembroke men. Edward stood rigid and composed, the very picture of dignified grief. William mirrored his father's stoic demeanor. James swayed slightly, likely hungover or possibly still drunk. And young Thomas, pale and red-eyed, his broken arm in a sling, seemed genuinely devastated by his grandmother's passing. I thought of Charlotte's final request, save Thomas. Get him away from Whitehaven. But how? The opportunity came sooner than I expected. After the funeral, Edward asked me to check on Thomas, who had developed a fever the previous night. Probably just exhaustion and grief, Edward said as he led me to the boys' room. But with his arm still healing, I thought it best to have you examine him. Thomas was indeed feverish, though not dangerously so. I prescribed rest and cool compresses, along with willow bark tea for the fever. I'll prepare a fresh supply of the syrup for his cough as well, I told Edward. If you'll show me to the kitchen, I can mix it now. Of course, though I believe Mrs. Davis could handle that task. The proportions must be precise, I insisted, and I've brought some new ingredients that may prove more effective. Edward seemed mildly surprised by my insistence, but agreed. Very well. This way. The kitchen was quiet, the staff having been given time off after preparing the funeral meal. Edward showed me to a work table near the large hearth. Will this suffice? Perfectly, though I'll need some honey from the pantry, if you don't mind. I'll have Mrs. Davis. No need to disturb her. Just point me in the right direction. Edward hesitated, then nodded toward a door at the far end of the kitchen. Through there. The honey should be on the second shelf to the right. Thank you. This won't take long. As soon as Edward left, I abandoned all pretense of medicine-making and hurried to the pantry. It was a large room lined with shelves holding preserves, dried goods, and kitchen staples. The eastern wall, as Charlotte had described, was covered with floor-to-ceiling shelving. I ran my hands along the edges of the shelves, searching for any mechanism that might reveal a hidden door. Nothing. I tried pushing, pulling, sliding. Still nothing. Frustration mounting, I began examining the contents of the shelves themselves. Could one of them be a lever or switch? A noise from the kitchen froze me in place. Someone had entered. I grabbed a jar of honey and was turning to leave when my eye caught a small anomaly in the pattern of the floorboards. Near the base of the eastern shelves, one board seemed slightly different in color and grain than its neighbors. Kneeling quickly, I pressed on it. Nothing happened. I tried sliding it, and to my surprise, it moved slightly. Glancing over my shoulder to ensure I was still alone, I worked my fingers into the small gap and pulled. The board came free, revealing a small lever set into the floor beneath. Heart pounding, I pulled the lever. A soft click, and then the entire shelving unit on the eastern wall shifted inward by an inch or two. I pushed, and it swung open like a door, revealing a narrow stone staircase descending into darkness. I had found the entrance to the cellars. The smart course of action would have been to replace the floorboard, close the hidden door, and leave Whitehaven immediately. I could return with authorities, demand an investigation. But who would believe such wild accusations against the Pembroke family without proof? And if Edward got wind of my suspicions before I could gather evidence, I had no doubt that measures would be taken to silence me. No, I needed to see for myself, to document what lay beneath Whitehaven. Getting a lantern from the kitchen, I lit it and stepped into the opening, pulling the shelf door nearly closed behind me. The air that rose from below was stale and damp, with an underlying scent that raised the hair on the back of my neck. The unmistakable musty odor of long-decayed organic matter. The stone steps were worn in the center, suggesting frequent use in some bygone era. 23 steps in total, leading to a heavy wooden door reinforced with iron bands. It wasn't locked. Perhaps the hidden entrance above was considered security enough. It opened with a groan of protest. The lantern light revealed a large chamber with a packed earth floor and stone walls. It might once have been a root cellar or storage room, but its current purpose was unmistakable. Along the walls, arranged with a grotesque attempt at order, were human skeletons. Dozens of them. Some still had fragments of clothing clinging to their bones. Others were adorned with the remnants of personal effects. A corroded pocket watch here, the tarnished frame of spectacles there. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the lantern in horror. James had not been exaggerating. If anything, he had understated the macabre collection beneath his family home. Forcing myself to remain calm, I moved further into the chamber. Some of the skeletons were clearly very old, the bones yellow-brown with age. Others appeared more recent, the remaining scraps of fabric less deteriorated. And in the far corner, partially obscured by shadows, was a sight that turned my blood to ice. A fresh grave, the earth still loose and only recently turned. Lucy. It had to be. The timing aligned too perfectly with her disappearance. I was so fixated on this grim discovery that I failed to notice the sound of footsteps on the stairs until it was too late. I whirled around to find Edward Pembroke standing in the doorway, a pistol held steadily in his hand. "I had hoped it wouldn't come to this, Dr. Blackwood," he said, his voice eerily calm. "I've always respected your medical abilities." "Edward," I said, struggling to keep my own voice steady, This is madness. You can't possibly think you can continue to hide this. Hide what? A family burial crypt? There's nothing unusual about that. This is no crypt. These people were murdered. Your grandmother told me everything before she died. Edward's expression hardened. My grandmother was a confused old woman in her final hours. Hardly a reliable source. And James? Is he confused too? He's seen this place. He knows what your family has done. James is a drunk and a wastrel who would say anything to undermine me. Edward gestured with the pistol. Move away from the wall. I complied, my mind racing for a way out of this deadly situation. There are 89 bodies down here, according to your grandmother. 89 murders, starting with the Mercer family. How many are yours, Edward? How many people have you killed to protect your precious family name? You wouldn't understand. No one who wasn't born to the responsibility could understand. For the first time, emotion cracked through Edward's controlled facade. Do you think I enjoy this? That I wanted this legacy? Then end it. Let the truth come out. Face justice for what's been done. He laughed bitterly. And destroy everything my grandfather and father built? Leave my children with nothing but a name stained by scandal? No, doctor. The secret stays buried, along with those who discover it. Like Lucy, I nodded toward the fresh grave. The girl was hysterical, spreading wild stories among the staff. I tried to send her away, but she threatened to go to the authorities with tales of ghosts and hands reaching from the ground. Edward shook his head. She left me no choice. And now I've left you no choice as well. I'm afraid so. He raised the pistol higher, aiming at my chest. For what it's worth, I regret this necessity. You're a good doctor. Wait, I said desperately. Before you shoot me, at least satisfy my curiosity. The stone wall where Thomas had his accident. That's where the Mercers are buried. Isn't it? That's why Lucy saw something there. Edward hesitated, then nodded. The original burial ground, yes. Grandfather moved the later additions to the cellars for greater security, but the first 24 are out there, beneath the wall he built to mark the eastern boundary of the original property. Mercer's Hope, I said. A name long forgotten and best left that way. Edward steeled himself, finger tightening on the trigger. Goodbye, Dr. Blackwood. What happened next occurred so quickly that I had little time to process it. A figure lunged from the shadows of the stairwell, crashing into Edward from behind. The pistol discharged, the ball flying wide and embedding itself in the earthen wall. Edward and his attacker fell to the ground, struggling for control of the weapon. It was James, his face contorted with rage and determination. "Run, doctor!" he shouted as he grappled with his brother. I should have fled, but I couldn't leave James to face Edward alone. I looked around desperately for a weapon and spotted a loose femur among the nearest skeletons. Grabbing it, I swung it like a club at Edward's head as he gained the upper hand over James. The bone connected with a sickening crack. Edward collapsed, blood streaming from a gash at his temple. Is he? I couldn't finish the question. James checked his brother's pulse. Still alive. But he won't be happy when he wakes up. He looked up at me, his eyes clear and sober for perhaps the first time since I'd met him. We don't have much time. William and the overseers will have heard the shot. What do we do? You get Thomas. Take him away from here, just as Mother asked you to do. You know about that? She told me her plan yesterday, before the end. He swallowed hard. Said you were the only one she trusted to save him from the Pembroke curse. And you? What will you do? James glanced around at the chamber of horrors that represented his family's darkest secret. End this. All of it. He reached into his coat and produced a small flask, uncorking it and splashing its contents onto the nearest wall. The sharp scent of lamp oil filled the air. James, no. The house is mostly stone. It won't burn easily. But these wooden supports, this door. He continued splashing oil around the chamber. Go, doctor. Get Thomas. There's a carriage waiting at the end of the oak alley, my doing, on Mother's instructions. Take him to Savannah, then north. As far from here as you can get. And what about justice? The authorities should know. There will be no justice for 89 ghosts, Doctor. Not in this world. James struck a match. This is the only peace they'll ever get. Now go. I hesitated only a moment longer, then ran for the stairs. The image of James standing amidst the bones of his family's victims was seared into my memory. Above, the house was in confusion. The gunshot had indeed been heard, and servants were rushing about trying to determine its source. In the chaos, I made my way to Thomas's room undetected. The boy was awake, his fever having broken. Dr. Blackwood? What's happening? I heard a loud noise. There's no time to explain, Thomas. You need to trust me. Your grandmother asked me to take you away from here. His eyes widened. Grandmother? When? Before she died. She was worried about you, about your safety. I helped him out of bed. Can you walk? He nodded, still confused but compliant. Where are we going? Away from Whitehaven. Far away. As I helped Thomas dress and gather a few essential belongings, I could smell smoke beginning to fill the house. Shouts of fire echoed down the hallways. We slipped out through a side entrance, avoiding the growing commotion at the east wing, where smoke was now visibly pouring from the lower windows. The carriage James had mentioned was indeed waiting at the end of the oak alley, the driver looking nervously toward the house. Dr. Blackwood! The shout came from behind us as we reached the carriage. William Pembroke was running toward us, a hunting rifle in his hands. Stop! What are you doing with my brother? Go! I yelled to the driver, practically throwing Thomas into the carriage before diving in after him. The driver needed no further encouragement, whipping the horses into motion just as William raised his rifle. A shot rang out, splintering the wood of the carriage door, but by then we were moving too quickly for accurate aim. The last I saw of Whitehaven was flames beginning to engulf the east wing, and William Pembroke standing in the oak alley, rifle lowered, watching us escape with an expression of fury and disbelief. That was 3 months ago. Thomas and I made it safely to Savannah and then took passage on a ship bound for New York. Using funds Charlotte had apparently arranged with James's help, we have established ourselves in a small town in Massachusetts, where I have opened a modest medical practice. Thomas, now recovered from his injuries, attends the local school and shows a keen interest in medicine. We received word last week that Whitehaven is no more. The fire that began in the east wing eventually consumed the entire mansion, though the outbuildings and fields remained largely intact. Edward Pembroke survived his injuries, only to face financial ruin as the truth about the bodies beneath his home began to emerge from the ashes. He took his own life before authorities could arrest him. William disappeared shortly after the fire, taking what remained of the family fortune with him. Some say he fled to Europe, others to the Western Territories. James's body was found in the burned cellars, alongside the remains of generations of Pembroke victims. As for the land itself, 5,000 acres of Georgia's richest soil, it lies abandoned now, considered cursed by locals who whisper about the 89 ghosts that haunt the ruins of Whitehaven. The Pembroke dynasty, built on cotton and blood, has finally crumbled. Thomas still has nightmares about voices beneath the floor. I tell him they're just dreams, echoes of a past he's better off forgetting. But sometimes, in the dark of night, I find myself listening for those same voices, the whispers of 89 souls finally finding their rest after decades of silent witness to the crimes that built a fortune and destroyed a family. The Pembroke legacy is ended. The ghosts, I pray, are at peace. But I still wonder about that stone wall at the eastern edge of the property, the first boundary of what was once called Mercer's Hope. And sometimes I imagine a pale hand reaching up through the soil, not in vengeance, but in gratitude for finally being acknowledged after 70 years of forgotten murder. Justice, in the end, finds its way to the surface. Just like the truth. Just like bones buried beneath a manor house built on blood and cotton in the fertile soil of Georgia.